going to torment him with fire. And so David was the one that was chosen by God, not only to be the future king, but to give consolation to the present king. Now we want to pick it up. We're in 1 Samuel 18. Beginning in 1 Samuel 18, the focus really shifts to David's relationships, especially two sets of David's relationships. The first set of relationships on which the biblical narrative focuses is on the house of Saul. And the key members in the house of Saul in this narrative is, first of all, King Saul himself, but also Saul's son Jonathan and Saul's daughter Michal. So on the one hand, while we're told back in 16 that Saul loved David greatly, 2 chapters later, David's relationship with Saul is going to completely deteriorate. On the other hand, we're also told that David is loved by Jonathan, he's loved by Michal, he's loved by Saul's servants. The second relationship on which the biblical narrative starts to focus is on David's relationship and David's reputation within the public eye. So I want to give us an overview of David's relationship with Saul. Saul becomes very angry very quickly with David. And Saul begins, the biblical narrative says, Saul begins to keep his eye on him. And the reason, after David slays Goliath, after the Israelites defeat the Philistines, the women of the towns of Israel celebrate. They celebrate David's victory by singing, Saul slew thousands, but David killed 10,000s. Saul becomes so jealous and threatened by David that Saul ironically muses, well, what more can David have except the kingdom of Israel? In other words, ironically, Saul speaks God's future, that indeed David will have the kingdom of Israel. And so we hear that not once, but twice, when the evil spirit of God returns upon Saul, Saul tries to pin David to the wall with a spear, while David is playing the lyre in an attempt to soothe Saul. That's how much Saul is deteriorating. Because Saul is afraid of David, Saul removes him from the presence of the court. Saul appoints him as military commander over his elite troops. And yet this completely backfires. Because Yahweh is with David, David is successful as a military commander. David is successful in whatever he undertakes. And of course, the more David is successful, the more Saul feels threatened, the more Saul wants to get rid of him. So the end result of David's ongoing success is not only Saul is deteriorating more, but we hear in 1 Samuel 18:16, all Israel and Judah love David. So you have this twin narrative. David is ascending, ascending, ascending. Saul is descending, descending, descending. Now, when Saul discovers that his daughter Michal has fallen in love with David, Saul thinks he can get rid of David. He maneuvers a proposal of marriage into a plot. Saul figures he can use his enemies, the Philistines, to get rid of David. And so Saul says to David, you want to marry my daughter? Here's the deal. Through Saul's servants, David is informed of a very grisly marriage price. If David wants to marry Michal, Saul's daughter, David has to produce the foreskins of 100 Philistines, which means David has to kill 100 Philistines and then circumcise their dead bodies. I mean, that's grisly. But God is with David. And so David and his men go out and they kill 200 Philistines and they bring back the foreskins and present them to Saul. And so Saul is now forced to give his daughter to David, his chief rival, in marriage. So, on the one hand, David is now Saul's son-in-law, but David is now Saul's sworn enemy. And Saul will not quit until he kills David, until he kills David's family, until he kills everyone who helps David. And to that end, Saul slaughters 85 priests and all the inhabitants of the city of Nob. And this is the extermination. Here's the biblical quote. Kills all the men and women and children and infants and oxen and donkeys and sheep, because one priest in that city helped David. He helped David, fed him, fed his men, and he also, the priest, gave him the sword of Goliath. And so Saul reacts with a total scorched earth policy. Now, besides David's relationship with Saul, the biblical narrative also focuses on David's relationship with Saul's two children, Jonathan and Michal. Because of his love for David, Jonathan makes an incredible covenant with David. Jonathan presents David with his own royal robe, with his armor, with his sword, with his bow, and with his belt. And by giving all those gifts to David, Jonathan is implicitly acknowledging that David, rather than him, will succeed Saul as the next king. Jonathan, everyone regards Jonathan as the next king. He's Saul's oldest son. Everyone regards him as the heir, and yet Jonathan somehow is seeing, no, it's David. And so he presents David with all the symbols of his royalty. And subsequently, when Jonathan hears about Saul's plot to kill David, he warns David. And then Jonathan even intercedes on David's behalf with his father. Saul relents. Saul swears an oath to Jonathan. He says, as Yahweh lives, he, David, shall not be put to death. But because Saul is so unstable, he reneges almost immediately on his oath. He forms new plots to kill David. But of course, first of all, they're thwarted by Michal. Michal, David's wife, Saul's daughter, warns David. And then also Jonathan, Saul's son, is loyal completely to David and so gets David out of town. But that also means David is on his own. David is on the run. But of course, because God is with David, things turn out in his benefit. So while David is on the run, while Saul is trying to kill him, we hear this. Everyone who is in distress, everyone who is in debt, everyone who is bitter in soul gathered to David, and he became commander over them. And there were with him about 400 men. In other words, the marginalized in Israel are now turning to David. David's kind of a Robin Hood figure. He's gathering around him those who are dispossessed, those who are dissatisfied. And so we hear in the biblical narrative, David saves cities of the tribe of Judah, and David's a member of the tribe of Judah. And so he's earning their loyalty. So David is building his own tribal base of support in Judah. During that time when David's on the run, he's got a guerrilla force. Twice he has the opportunity to assassinate Saul. Twice David refuses to do the deed. David and his followers, while he's on the run, they become mercenaries for the Philistines, Israel's sworn enemy. David has hired himself and his men out to work for the Philistines. And at the same time, because David's playing both ends against the middle, David raids some of the Philistine cities, and like Robin Hood, to whom does he give the spoils? To his followers and to the people of the tribe of Judah. Now, we also hear, and this is in 1 Samuel 25, David is, he and his men are mercenaries. They're on their own. And he encounters a guy named Nabal. And Nabal's wife is Abigail. And David seeks hospitality from Nabal, and Nabal insults David and his men. David is incensed. David wants to kill Nabal, but Nabal's wife, Abigail, comes to David and essentially says, my husband is a fool. Don't kill him. Because if David kills him, David incurs blood guilt. And we're going to see blood guilt in a couple things here. Blood guilt is essentially if one member of Israel kills another member of Israel, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's what blood guilt is. If you shed the blood of another member of the tribe of Israel, you've incurred the guilt of shedding their blood. And so Abigail dissuades David from doing that. Fortunately for David, Nabal dies. And so David marries Abigail as well as another woman. So David is collecting wives. And when Saul hears that, he takes his daughter, Michal, David's wife, and Saul marries her off to another man. So we've got this grand national scope, and we've got these dysfunctional family dynamics going on at the same time. And then as we approach the end of 1 Samuel, what God declared back in 1 Samuel 13, what is taking place over the years now starts to happen. The fall of Saul. And it starts out that the Philistines are once again to march against Saul and his army. For over 200 years, the sworn enemies of Israel are the Philistines. And remember, we mentioned last time, the Philistines have superiority in terms of military technology. They have iron. The Israelites don't. They have chariots. The Israelites don't. They have more troops than the Israelites. So we hear near the end of 1 Samuel in the narrative, the Philistines are now coming out again against Saul and his army. At first, remember, David is a mercenary working for the Philistines. And at first, the Philistine king, under whom David serves, he enlists David to be his bodyguard for life. That puts David in a really precarious spot, because is David going to serve with the Philistines against Saul and the Israelites? Well, fortunately for David, the other Philistine commanders remember. They remember what the women of Israel sung, that David's reputation is the slayer of 10,000 Philistines, and they don't want any part of David being in their army. So they refuse to let David and his men accompany them into battle. So ironically and inadvertently, the Philistines spared David of any blood guilt. They spared David from fighting against Saul and the Israelite army. So now David, the Philistines put David on the sidelines. But Saul is so desperate as the Philistines are advancing on him that we hear in 1 Samuel 28, Saul secretly goes to a witch of Endor. And previously, Saul had banned all witches. Anyone practicing witchcraft would be put to death. But Saul himself disguises himself and he goes to the witch at Endor. And he asks the witch of Endor to conjure up the spirit of dead Samuel. Saul's so desperate, he uses a witch to get Samuel to come up from the dead so that Saul could ask Samuel, what am I supposed to do? And the spirit of the dead Samuel delivers this fatal message. So 1 Samuel 28:16. And this is, remember, dead Samuel. And Samuel said, why then do you ask me, since Yahweh has turned from you and become your enemy? Yahweh has done this to you as he spoke by me, for Yahweh has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of Yahweh. Therefore, Yahweh has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, Yahweh will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. Remember, Samuel's dead. In other words, Saul and his sons are going to join Samuel in death. Yahweh will give the army of Israel also into the hands of the Philistines. So like I said last time, Saul is really the King Lear of the Old Testament. I mean, he is fated to be this tragic figure. And Samuel's spirit delivers that fatal message to him. And lo and behold, the very next day on Mount Gilboa, the Philistines totally decimate the Israelite army. Jonathan, who is a hero, is dead. Saul's other two sons are dead. When the Philistines are moving in, there's no hope. Saul orders his armor bearer to kill him because he doesn't want to fall into the hands of the uncircumcised Philistines. But the armor bearer refuses. The armor bearer says, I can't kill the king. And so Saul takes his own sword, falls upon it, and dies. When the Philistines find Saul's body, they cut off his head. They place his armor in the temple of Ashtoreth, trophies of war, and they nail Saul's beheaded body. They nail Jonathan's body. They nail the other two sons' bodies to the walls of the city of Bethshan. But we hear this interesting thing. Valiant men from the city of Jabesh Gilead come at night. They retrieve the body of the beheaded Saul. They retrieve Jonathan's body. They retrieve the body of the other two sons, and they give them an honorable burial. Now, why is that significant? If you go back 2 weeks ago, Saul's first victory, the king of Ammon had surrounded Jabesh Gilead, had ordered them to surrender, and then said, the terms of surrender, we're going to gouge out the right eye of every man in the city. And Saul lifted the siege, defeated the Ammonites, and saved the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead. Well, now, decades later, the men of Jabesh Gilead remember what Saul did for them. And so they come and get Saul's body and the bodies of his sons to give them an honorable burial. So this is biblical narrative. I mean, this is stuff 2,500 years ago, but it's like you have some of the best authors today, how the narrative keeps coming back in on itself. So Saul is dead. Jonathan is dead. David is not stupid. David mourns the death of Saul and Jonathan. So David has managed to avoid any blood guilt in the deaths of Jonathan, the death of Saul. But David is smart enough to publicly mourn their death. And so he pays tribute to them in a song. And listen to the refrain of this song. Now we're into 2 Samuel chapter 1. This is David. Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Your daughters of Israel weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perish. We had 3 times you get that refrain where he's paying tribute to Saul and Jonathan, how the mighty have fallen. So now you got a whole new development within God's people. You got 2 kingdoms and 2 kings. In the immediate wake of the death of Saul and Jonathan, you get a division. So you get the kingdom of Judah, that's the tribe of Judah, southern Israel. You get the kingdom of Israel, the 11 tribes, central and northern Israel. So in the wake of Saul's death, David is anointed king over the single tribe of Judah in the south. And that's because David took care of his fellow tribes people, the Judeans. Up north, Abner. Abner was Saul's general. Abner takes Saul's son Ishbaal and makes him king over the 11 tribes in the north. So Abner is the real power behind the throne in the north. David is the power in the south. And so you got a civil war. You have the house of Saul versus the house of David. And so we hear in 2 Samuel 3, there was a long war between the house of Saul, the house of David. And David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. So the house of Saul was all dependent on Jonathan. But years before, Jonathan had sworn his loyalty to David. With the death of Jonathan, there's there's no descendant that has any power. Ishbaal is weak, he's not a warrior. So Abner, Saul's general, is calling the shots. There's also a personal vendetta between Abner, Saul's general, and Joab, David's general. Abner is manipulating. He manipulated to get Ishbaal king, but then when Abner sees the future is with David, not with Ishbaal, Abner cuts a private deal with David. Abner promises to deliver Israel, the 11 tribes of the north, to deliver them to David to be their king. Now, of course, Abner's not stupid. If Abner can deliver the 11 tribes to David so David could be their king, Abner knows David will reward him. That Abner will become the right-hand man of the new power of God's people. David agrees to this secret deal under one condition. He wants Michal, his former wife, Saul's daughter, he wants her returned because that consolidates his power over all 12 tribes. For Abner, that's no sweat. You could have Michal, so he turns Michal over to David, and he also maneuvers to get the other 11 tribes for David. But in the meantime, I mean, this is like the mafia. 2 assassinations occur. Joab, David's general, assassinates Abner. You know, Abner's pulling the strings behind the scenes. Well, Joab kills Abner for 2 reasons. One is personal and one is business. Joab kills Abner personally because Abner had killed Joab's brother. But also, Joab has Abner rubbed out because if Abner comes into David's court, guess who's going to replace Joab as David's right-hand man? It's going to be Abner. So Joab assassinates Abner. Potential blood guilt. David publicly says, I'm innocent. Joab did the deed. Blood guilt is on him. The other assassination. 2 men in King Ishbaal's court realizes we're screwed. Ishbaal is thrown out. And so they assassinate Ishbaal. They cut off Ishbaal's head. They take Ishbaal's head, and guess who they bring it to? David. And they're thinking David's going to be so happy that here's the head of the other king, they'll get rewarded. David knows blood guilt. David says, no, 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 no. And he has the 2 assassins assassinated. And then David has Ishbaal's head buried in Abner's tomb. David wants publicly everything to be up front. And so now David is anointed king over all Israel. So we hear in 2 Samuel 5, then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And Yahweh said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel. You shall be prince over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before Yahweh, and they anointed David king over Israel. So what Yahweh had planned decades earlier, finally, all of God's people now recognize and acknowledge. So, on the one hand, David's always been the king to replace Saul. That's Yahweh's plan. It's for Yahweh's plan. Now, on the other hand, David is finally recognized king by and for all Israel. But David has never been one to rest on his laurels, going all the way back to when he slew Goliath. In a series of brilliant political, religious, and military moves, David works to consolidate his reign over Israel. First, Jerusalem. Up to this point in the history of God's people, Jerusalem was a Jebusite city. Jerusalem was right on the border between the tribe of Benjamin and the tribe of Judah. Jerusalem didn't belong to any Israelite tribe. Okay, so it was like a little Switzerland in the middle. So thus it's the perfect spot for David's capital if David can conquer it. It doesn't belong to anyone else. It can belong to David. And so we hear, and the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land. David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around him from the Milo inward. And David became greater and greater, for Yahweh, the God of hosts, was with him. So what we hear in the biblical narrative, David and his men, he got this incredible stronghold of a city up on the hill. They come into the city through the water shaft. So they come into the city within the walls, underground, and they conquer the Jebusites. So now Jerusalem is the city of David. The next move, David defeats the dreaded Philistines. So we hear, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David. But David heard of it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And David inquired of Yahweh, shall I go out against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? And Yahweh said to David, go up. I'll certainly give the Philistines into your hand. David came to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them. So the Philistines here, David is in power over all Israel. We got to nip this in the bud. We got to defeat David. And look, the valley of Rephaim, that's like 6 miles out of Jerusalem. So they literally gather their armies at the doorstep of David's new capital. David asks Yahweh, should I go out there? Yahweh says yes. Subsequently, this pattern repeats itself. Again, the Philistines muster up against David. David inquires of Yahweh, should I go against them? Yahweh says, I'll give the Philistines into your hand, so that David's victories eliminate the threat of the Philistines. For over 200 years, the Philistines have been the mortal enemies of Israel, and the Philistines always come back, always come back. Samson defeats the Philistines. Philistines come back. Saul defeats the Philistines. Philistines come back. David has eliminated the Philistine threat. So first David gets Jerusalem, his city, his capital. Then he defeats the Philistines. And now David is going to solidify his ties with Saul's family. Again, he avoided any blood guilt with Saul's death. He has Michal returned to him. He restores Saul's property to Jonathan's surviving son, Saul's grandson. The guy was named Mephibosheth. So he restores all of Saul's property to Saul's surviving heir, Mephibosheth, but then he makes Mephibosheth part of David's own court. Okay, so we're not going to have a renegade grandson out there somewhere. Come into my court, eat at my table. So he's neutralized any threat from Saul's heirs. And then we hear of David's further military victories. David leads his personal army. Okay, so is it the army of God or is it the army of David? And the answer is yes. David leads his personal army to military victory over 6 different nations. He defeats the Philistines to the west, the Amalekites to the southwest, the Edomites to the southeast, the Moabites to the southeast, the Ammonites to the east, and up into the kingdom up here. So David expands Israel's border in all directions. Israel has never been larger, has never been more powerful as a nation in the Middle East than under David. But David's not done. Not only has he defeated his military enemies, not only has he made Jerusalem his capital, but David brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. For over 40 years, remember we talked about this the very first time, the Philistines captured the Ark, the hand of Yahweh struck down the Philistines with hemorrhoids. Philistines finally said, get the Ark back to Israel, get it out of here. But the Israelites even knew the Ark was too powerful. So it's been in mothballs for 40 years in the house of Abinadab. But David goes, the Ark symbolizes the presence and power of God. So David brings the Ark to Jerusalem in this grand processional. David has the Ark placed in a tent that David constructed for it. And that's where, if you remember, David dances naked in front of the Ark in this triumphal parade. Now, David's enthusiastic but rather risque dancing in this public processional leads to the falling out with Michal. Michal is so incensed that her husband did such a public display that she says, no more. You can't do that. And David just says, I'm not going to have sex with you anymore. I'll have sex with your assistant, your court, your concubine. I'm not going to have sex with you. Now think of this. David's not stupid. If David has a child with Michal, that's not only going to be David's son, it's going to be whose grandson? Saul's. No more sex with Michal. Okay, she's out. And then David has this magnificent festival. There are burnt offerings to Yahweh. Okay, so when you have burnt offerings, you sacrifice animals and you do a burnt offering, because how else can you get the gift of the offering up to God? Well, you burn it so the smoke goes up to God to honor God and God can enjoy it, but you don't burn the whole animal. You take the rest of the meat and you give it to the people, because the people don't eat meat on a regular basis. So you have this grand banquet for the people of Israel. And who are they going to thank for it? David. I mean, this is just brilliant public maneuvering. I mean, this again, go back to The Godfather. Someday, while I do this favor for you, I might ask for a favor. So Israel's most sacred object, the Ark of the Covenant, was under the direct control of King David in King David's city. So we want to do one more thing. Building projects. David has a building project, and Yahweh has a building project. So we hear 2 Samuel 7. Now, when the king lived in his house, Yahweh had given him rest from all surrounding enemies. The king said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent." And Nathan said to the king, "Go and do all that's in your heart, for Yahweh is with you." So David plans to build a permanent structure for the ark, i.e., David wants to build a temple. But of course, David isn't stupid. All Israel, when they want to come and worship God, where do they have to come? In David's city, to the temple that David built, consolidating power. This is also the first introduction of Nathan the prophet. So suddenly, Samuel was the last prophet that we had heard of. Now Nathan is the prophet. He's the divine advisor. And he blesses the project. But Yahweh doesn't. The same night the word of Yahweh came to Nathan. "Go and tell my servant David, thus says Yahweh, would you build a house, build me a house to dwell in? I haven't lived in a house since the day I brought up people from Israel from Egypt. But I've been moving about in a tent in all places where I move with all the people of Israel. Did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people, saying, why haven't you built me a house of cedar?" In other words, Yahweh seems reluctant to have a permanent residence. Yahweh has a portable presence with Israel, going all the way back hundreds of years before with the Exodus. So here's the big promise. Yahweh has a building project. So Nathan delivers the message. "Moreover, Yahweh declares to you that Yahweh will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled, you lie down with your fathers. I will raise up your offspring after you, and you should, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I'll establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father. He shall be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I'll discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me, and your throne shall be established forever." So in other words, Yahweh's building project is to establish David's house forever, so that descendants of David will rule over God's people forever. Now that promise in 2 Samuel 7, that becomes crucial even into the New Testament. So God has promised a descendant of David will rule over God's people forever. Now in the Old Testament, the thinking was a descendant of David will have a son. That son will rule over Israel. And then that son will die. Boom. He'll have a son and will rule over. And so you have all the descendants of David sequentially will rule over forever. In the New Testament, going back to Matthew, going back to Luke, God is going to fulfill that promise, not with a sequence of son after son after son. God's going to fill that promise by having one descendant rule God's people forever. And so in the theology of the New Testament, part of the meaning of the resurrection is that Jesus, descendant of David, is raised from the dead, and Jesus, son of David, rules over God's people forever. So, and here's where we need to leave it. Through God's promise, God's present, David's immediate future, David's long-term future, even after his death, seems to be set. What could possibly go wrong? Because David has been given everything he possibly needs from God. And then we hear this. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. They ravaged the Ammonites. They besieged Rabbah. But David remained behind in Jerusalem. King David is not where he's supposed to be. He's supposed to be fighting out with his army. He's always done that. He's always led God's army in Israel. But now David stays behind in Jerusalem. And that's a giant oh. And that's where, yes, dun, 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 dun. That's where we'll leave it. We'll pick it up for our last session next week. So you want to come back. Or else go home and read your Bible.